and hello everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizer for this opportunity to share my research in this seminar. Thank you.
Is that all right? Can everybody
Yeah, that's
see that?
fine. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. So yes, I have been looking into the translation and reception of French literature in Iceland for several years, for different reasons and from different points of view. And one of the fascinating parts of this research is concerned with the emergence of children's literature in 18th century Iceland. And this will be the topic of my talk, and I wish to show how one of the very first authors of children's books in Iceland found inspiration and material in the well-known Le Magasin des enfants, and how he translated some parts of this book for his target group. So if you could please pass, yes. Le Magasin des enfants was written by the French author Madame Jeanne-Marie Leprince de Beaumont, and it was first published in London in 1756. Well, it was not the first, but one of the first texts published for children in the 18th century. After teaching at different places in France for several years, Madame Leprince de Beaumont spent 15 years approximately in London, where she worked as a governess for prominent families, teaching French, for instance. And she also wrote and published a great number of books, and many of them were written for young people, mainly girls and young women. And Le Magasin des enfants contains 24 dialogues extending over 27 days. The dialogue is a traditional framework for educational purposes, but it's also a very lively one. The conversations in this book are organized around a governess and a small group of girls from 7 to 12 years old. And inside this framework, the author transmits religious and moral knowledge, stories, geography, and natural sciences. These are practical and pleasant readings that are easily understood for children, but the book can also be seen as a handbook for women in the same situation as Le Prince de Beaumont. Can you pass, please? Many of the dialogues are organized around fairy tales, and even if the tales only cover a small part of the work as a whole, they are, in a way, its very core, since they give place to questions, answers, anecdotes, and so on. In the introduction to the book, the author does not reveal the titles of her sources, but studies have shown that some of her fairy tales stem from earlier collections written by French authors like Charles Perrault, Madame d'Aulnoy, and Madame de Villeneuve. And as far as I know, Le Prince de Beaumont did not translate, but she adapted and rewrote her texts for her young target group. And soon after its first publication, Le Magasin des enfants was translated or adapted into over a dozen languages, including Danish, German, English, Spanish, and so on. Can you please, yes, pass to the next one. Le Magasin des enfants was never translated into Icelandic, and yet many of the fairy tales from the book were well known in the country as soon as the early 19th century. How can that be explained? When I started looking into this question, I was convinced that the Danish translation would be the answer. And why is that? Well, from the end of the 14th century until the early 20th, Iceland was under the Danish crown. With no urban development and no universities, young Icelanders were sent to Copenhagen to study mainly law and theology. And that is why new cultural and political currents and ideas reached Iceland mainly through Copenhagen and the Danish language. But I was wrong about the Danish translation. One of the young Icelandic schoolboys sent to Denmark to study theology in order to become a priest was in fact very interested in philology and in literature. His name was Hannes Finnsson, which means John, son of Finn. He came from a respected family in Iceland. He was only 17 when he left, and he would be spending approximately 20 years in the Danish capital before returning home with a considerable collection of books. And he was one of the great figures of the Enlightenment in Iceland and was finally appointed bishop, which was a very powerful position at the time. In this office, he was concerned about the education of young Icelanders, which was mainly confined to the parents. And he was eager to increase literacy and fight superstition, but he also wanted to entertain and induce cultural change in the society. And he criticized the traditional vigils that took place during the long nights in the farmhouses, where someone, a member or a passerby, would read aloud from religious books or tell stories, as you can see in this painting from the middle of the 19th century, showing an Icelandic farmhouse. The next one, please. In this painting, which is from approximately 1780, you can see the bishop's seat in the southern part of Iceland, where Hannes Finnsson lived and worked. And until the second part of the 18th century, this was one of the most densely populated places in the country. But coming back to the vigils, why did the bishop not approve of the readings and the stories? In his opinion, the old stories, sagas of knights and battles that were still very much appreciated by Icelanders at that time were useless and vain. And the popular tales were even worse. They spoke of giants and ghosts, and these stories only frightened the young ones. And more surprisingly, maybe, he was opposed to the Bible or other religious texts being used to teach children how to read, because they would most likely induce the young readers to dislike the Holy Word. The next one, please. In order to change this situation, the bishop wrote and published his own reading book for the Vigils. The title, The Vigils, 1794, clearly describes the purpose of the book. It was divided into 69 vigils, starting the first day of winter, and it contains a great variety of texts, tales, fables, riddles, fragmentary thoughts, two plays, scientific chapters, dialogues, and religious explanations for a proper Sunday reading. This important work is one of the very first books for children ever published in Iceland. Daily lectures were imposed by the Lutheran Church, namely for children, but in most Icelandic homes there were only religious books to be found. The popular tales that I mentioned earlier were told, they were not read. So the Vigils 1794 represented a remarkable change, and this amalgam of text was neatly organized and structured as daily lectures, where conversations also played an important role. The next one, please. Thank you. In my research on this topic, I realized soon that some of the fairy tales from Le Magasin des Enfants could be found in the Vigils 1794, and I immediately thought that the bishop had used the Danish translation of the French book in his work, since very few Icelanders had the opportunity and the need to learn French. I then compared the tales translated by the bishop with the Danish ones, and it was easy to see that they were slightly different. While looking through the archives and the manuscripts left by the bishop, I then found out that while in Denmark he had bought that while he was studying in Denmark, he had bought at least two of Leprince de Beaumont's books, Le Magasin des Enfants and Le Magasin des Adolescentes. And furthermore, I came across a detailed analysis of the contents of these two books made by the bishop himself. You can see a part of it here on this slide. And this close lecture of Leprince de Beaumont's writing must have convinced the bishop of using fairy tales for didactic and moral purposes. This may, of course, appear as a paradox. Why discredit Icelandic popular tales and stories to replace them by French fairy tales? Especially at this time when most Icelandic intellectuals would rather praise their own culture and language, and when fairy tales were not highly considered by educated men. Well, in my opinion, the bishop was strongly influenced and impressed also by Leprince de Beaumont's writings, and he must have thought that Icelandic children could learn more from her tales about how to behave while enjoying a good story than from popular tales of giants and ghosts. The next one, please. As far as I know, translation for children was not discussed formally in the late 18th century. Therefore, it is interesting to see how the bishop, who was an experimented teacher, shapes and presents his own strategy in this field. It is clear from the introduction that the author wishes to entertain, but also to contribute to a cultural change in his country. And he briefly mentions the translated texts in his introduction, without naming the authors though, and he explains that these are not the best examples of good literature, but that they are good enough and suitable for the target group, Icelandic youth belonging to the common people. And then he explains how he wants his text to be: simple, easily understood, without pretension, without any foreign words that his readers might not understand. And without using the exact term, he domesticates many of the translated texts, and this can be seen in most of the 7 tales. Most of the 7 tales translated, where the bishop replaces the original titles by new ones, replaces the names of the protagonists by Icelandic names, and so on. Next one, please. Here on the left, you can see the 7 titles that he translates and the translation of the right, and it is remarkable that no title has been translated directly. And the most surprising change is the title of the story of the Beauty and the Beast at the bottom of the list, where he actually renames this tale and gives it a new name, which is The Good Monster. The next one, please. I have read and studied closely the fairy tales borrowed from Leprince de Beaumont, and they all contain interesting examples of adaptation and domestication meant to facilitate the comprehension of the reader or reduce the role of the supernatural. However, that is not the case with The Beauty and the Beast, where the translator does not try to rationalize the supernatural, probably because the greater the horror of the beast, the greater the sacrifice and the kindness of the young woman. But according to the criticism, or his own criticism of dreadful Icelandic tales, he changes the title of the story, and from the beginning the reader knows that the monster is good and that there is nothing to be afraid of. And other minor changes can be found, such as instrument instead of harpsichord, breakfast instead of hot chocolate, and both are known to the Icelandic reader. Another interesting change can be seen where the translator adds new values to the text, so to speak. Like here, where the narrator describes the difference between the 2 older sisters and the youngest one. In the French original, we read, "Every day they went dancing, to see a play, and went for a stroll, and they mocked their younger sister, who spent most of her time reading good books. Can you come back, please? Yes, there, thank you. Whereas in the Icelandic translation, we read, every day they went dancing to parties and entertainment and made fun of their younger sister who spent most of her time reading good books or doing something useful. And now the next one, please. Here is another example of this emphasis on work and house chores. In the French text, we read, the beauty woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and started cleaning the house and preparing the meal for the family. In the Icelandic translation, the beauty wakes up at 4:30, which corresponds to the division of time in Iceland in the 18th century. She swept the floor, attended to the animals, and prepared the food for all the people. Of course, this refers to the chores in the Icelandic countryside, where most children worked hard and many people lived in the same farm, not only the family. And now it's time to conclude. I'm still working on the vigils 1794. It has taken more time than I thought, but I am getting somewhere. The book is a fascinating example of a culturally induced translation where the translator is very much aware of his task and defines a translation strategy which was also meant to explain to his friends and equals the choice of texts in this particular book and also why he refrains from using more complicated language. The bishop may not have considered the Vigils 1794 as one of his greatest achievements. Nevertheless, it was one of the most widely read books in the country until 1850, and the fairy tales were probably the text that his target group appreciated the most. And as a proof of their popularity, we know that some of them circulated orally during the 19th century and even longer. However, the legacy and influence of Madame Leprince de Beaumont has not been recognized earlier in the shaping of this work and in the emergence of children literature in Iceland. Thank you.